Welcome to The Girlfriend God, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional spiritual experience. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to subscribe, follow, rate it, review it, and share it with your friends. Now, together, let's find the divine. So here we go. Welcome to another episode of The Girlfriend God, podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Alka Arora. She's an associate professor in the Women's Spirituality program at CIIS, where she's been teaching since 2011. She received her PhD in Women's Studies from the University of Washington. For over a decade, Dr. Arora has been developing the field of integral feminist education and feminist spiritual activism, and we'll define some of these terms as we get into the episode. She works alongside sister scholars to offer transdisciplinary and socially engaged approaches to the study of gender, spirituality, and religion. Dr. Arora serves as a thought leader on feminist spirituality, integral feminist education, and veganism via her writing, public talks, and interactive workshops. She's spoken at over 40 national and international conferences, including the Parliament of World Religions, National Women's Studies Association, the American Academy of Religion, and International Leadership Association. She's also the certified facilitator of Gender Equality and Reconciliation International Workshops, which draw upon truth-telling and dialogue to transform gender relations. In addition to teaching at CIIS, Dr. Arora offers coaching and consulting in the areas of women's spirituality, leadership, and higher education, and you can find all of her links in the show notes. Dr. Arora, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kelly, and please do feel free to call me Alka. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
As somebody who spent time in academia, I know that some people are very prickly about being called doctor, so yeah. I kind of got into that habit, but I appreciate that since the show is casual and we talk about that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there were a lot of things. There's a lot of things in your bio that immediately brought to mind a bunch of questions, but first, I would like you to, because you never know who's listening to the show, right? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about integral and interdisciplinary, because I think the meaning of those words often escapes people.
Sure.
So in what you teach, like what is an integral, interdisciplinary, like what does that look like?
Yeah, thank you. I know it's somewhat jargony there. So I'll start with interdisciplinary. And the field of women's spirituality, which I teach in, is interdisciplinary. The fields of women's studies are interdisciplinary. And sometimes we say transdisciplinary, actually. And what that means is the discipline is in academia, something like, psychology or anthropology or political science. And when the field of women and gender studies began, in the second wave of feminism and back in the 70s, it was understood that in order to really understand women's lives under patriarchy, we couldn't just look at it from one disciplinary perspective. It's not just a psychological or sociological or political, it's all of these, right? And so that's why we use the term interdisciplinary and sometimes transdisciplinary, because interdisciplinary still means, well, these different disciplines are talking to each other, and transdisciplinary is like, let's just even stop talking about the disciplines at all and just ask questions and do research on them. Right, so there are a little bit of jargony terms used in academia, but that's what it refers to. Now, the term integral is a little bit less known. And the way I use the term integral is more specific to how we use it at my institution, the California Institute of Integral Studies, which comes from the integral yoga tradition of a spiritual teacher, Sri Aurobindo, and his spiritual partner, Mira Alfasa, also known as the Mother. And their sort of vision of integral yoga or integral education also was that education isn't just about knowledge of the material world, but also has to be the whole person, right? So spiritual, emotional, all of it. And so that's kind of where the word integral entered my vocabulary, was through teaching at CIIS. And then I sort of adapted it to talk about its integration with feminism.
So what made you pursue CIS? I mean, was that your goal the whole time you were in your PhD program? Or did you get your PhD and you were like, I don't know what the fuck I want to do now. Let me look and see what's out there, because CIIS is they're a very unique institution, right?
Yeah,
It's not like a traditional four-year college. I mean, it
abs-
is in some ways, but
no, you're absolutely right. And for your listeners, you can learn more about it at www.cis.edu, but it's definitely a very non-traditional university. And honestly, if I hadn't found CIS, I probably wouldn't be in academia anymore. Because when I was in my PhD program in women's studies, I mean, I feel like I got an amazing intellectual education and political growth and all of these wonderful things. But it was a very, there's so much sort of anti-spirituality in certain
right.
segments of the feminist
And
social
and,
justice
and we're going to
community.
talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I ended up, I had a mentor though. Who was very, very supportive, Dr. Kate Noble. And so I did end up writing my dissertation on women's spiritual activism, because that was a personal interest of mine. And, I was in grad school in my 20s, and I was concurrently going through my own, emotional, psychological challenges, as long depression and trying to find meaning, and
Right.
going to meditation centers and on the spiritual quest. And it just felt like I didn't have room in my academic program to talk about that.
Right.
Right. Because it was just sociopolitical. Right. And I was like, well, what about how I feel? Like, what about the inner life?
Right.
Um, and so when I graduated, I also was just a little bit like, I mean, even though I learned so much, it's not that I regretted my degree, but I just felt like at certain levels at advanced academia, the discourse, the conversations became very abstract, and people would debate about these very, very minor points and journal articles that they were reading. And I was like, what are we actually doing to like liberate women?
Right. But are we going to stop talking about it and do something?
Yeah, yeah. And or even if we're talking about it in a way that we can spread ideas that are accessible to a wider public, right?
Right. Right.
Not,
Academia tends to just kind of, we live in our own little silo behind
yeah.
paywalls, usually, and we're
Right.
only talking to each other, which is kind of, I mean, my master's degree is in library and information science. So, of
Oh, okay.
course, librarians, the typically librarians as a whole are very aware and social justice driven, and you know what I
Yeah.
mean. So of course in that realm we talked a lot about how to um, disseminate information, and we talked about things like, we started publishing open access articles because
Mhm.
as a community we were kind of against this whole paywall thing. I mean,
Right.
libraries are a business too and they have to make money, but um,
And then
so that was
yeah, sorry to interrupt, but the thing
that's
about
okay.
that like also just, drives me crazy is that it's not the academics that are making the money off of those,
Right.
right? I
Right.
mean, if we were, it'd be like, well, at least we're getting some more, money for our intellectual labor. I mean, we get
Right.
paid by universities, but not, additional monies for publishing articles and journals and things
Right.
like that. So it's
Right.
really the publishing houses that are,
Exactly.
that's a whole other
Exactly. That
conversation.
is a whole other
Yeah.
conversation. So, you had said something in the I mentioned that I listened to the podcast episode you did on fourth
Mhm.
wave feminism, which is where we're at now, right? I mean, fourth wave feminism is all inclusive, which is kind of the first wave of feminism to do that, right? That men are coming into the conversation, because I've said that on this podcast before, like we can't just get rid of all the men, right? Like
And we
there
would, yeah, we don't want to even,
there
yeah.
needs to be another solution. And I have found that in my own work, I started a nonprofit called Church of the Goddess, and I had a series on YouTube called Priestess at the Altar, and would constantly ask for feedback and comments. And it's hard to get people to engage on social media beyond a like or a follow or whatever. But I heard from 3 people in 6 months, and all of them were men,
Wow.
saying, of course, 2 out of 3 of them wanted positions of power, right? How can I
Mm,
become a deacon in the church? How can I
mm.
open a chapter of the church where I live? I'm like, yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Um, but even them, all 3 of them were like, there is no place for male goddess worshipers in goddess spirituality. And they're
Mm.
right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I kind of stand between those two worlds of like I see the need for that, but I also see the need for this tradition of women only circles. You know what I mean? So how do you rectify that? It always seems like we're at an impasse when we talk about that, especially in terms of spirituality. I mean, like the Wiccans and the pagans and those groups kind of have it going on, but most of them are polytheistic and they worship gods and goddesses.
Mm-hmm.
So where is the space for goddess worshipers solely, that are men?
Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, it is a very interesting phenomenon. I think that's very much a Western phenomenon where the
Agreed.
goddess is associated with women's worship, right? Like if you go to India, which is where my ancestry is from.
Right.
I mean, it's a very patriarchal culture. Don't get me wrong. I'm not,
Right.
glorifying it in any way in that sense. But there's no sense that women worship goddesses and men worship gods,
Right.
right? I mean, there are even like goddess temples where the men are like completely in charge and women are not even, like
Right.
allowed the
Right.
equal access, right?
Right.
So that is because I think it's understood there more in an energetic sense of, these energies of gods and goddesses, and it's
Right.
not necessarily, yeah, it's just a different phenomenon, also being a more I would call it a panentheistic culture where there is a
Mhm.
multiplicity of gods and goddesses, but they're understood also as part of one underlying unified reality.
Right.
But coming to a Western context, which is where we are, I mean, Carol Chris wrote this very, sort of famous article decades ago called Why Women Need the Goddess.
Right.
And I really think we need, a follow-up to that, maybe probably written by a man, Why Men Need the Goddess,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because patriarchal religion has hurt men in so many ways,
Right.
especially if they don't conform to, sort of patriarchal standards of manhood, whether they're queer or even if they're straight, but somehow don't, really align with that ideology.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, and I have this conversation with other women a lot, right? Like, you said something in that podcast episode that really resonated with me. You said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but you said theoretical empowerment worked for a while,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we theorize a lot, and I myself have heard myself say, in an attempt to explain my beliefs to other people, intellectually, I understand that whatever God is doesn't have a gender, right? It's
Yeah,
a non-physical entity.
right.
But for my empowerment and for other women, saying goddess
Mhm.
is a radical act in and of itself. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But just like you were saying about academia, even in spiritual circles, we talk a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be very much in the abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Often on the show, people are taken aback when I ask them about their own spiritual practice, because I think, okay, you've studied these things and you can talk about it a lot, but what's your spiritual life like? And you said
Mhm.
something about women coming out of the spiritual broom closet. And I think that is a disconnect that we need to bridge because in ancient times and even in prehistory, we live, especially in the West, we live in a world where like we live on this material plane and then the spiritual plane is like up here. But in
Mhm.
prehistory, there was no separation. My
Mhm.
spirit, people talk about, oh, my spiritual life. Their spiritual life was their life, right?
Right.
It
You
was
wouldn't need to use that language because it's all integrated.
right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know. I like I wrestle with this a lot, right? Like, how do we? It's great to have knowledge and it's great to pass on knowledge, but how do we collectively use our collective spiritual experience in social justice, in political activism? You know what I mean? How do we, like, I had Marilyn Nyborg on the show who wrote Sacred Activism, and, but how? That's the question I always come back to. How? How do we do it?
So how do we engage in social justice? What's your
How do we incorporate a collective spirituality into the fight for equality, into fourth wave feminism?
hmm, wow. That's a deep question. There's a lot to say there. I guess
Yes, there is. And that was intentional because there's a
yeah,
lot to
there's
say
so
there.
many, yeah. But I think and there's probably many different answers we could explore at different times, but what's coming to my mind in this moment is very much sort of reclaiming this idea of the sacred and that all of us, all beings are sacred,
Right,
regardless, I mean, and then because of our diversities of genders and bodies and skin colors and all of these aspects. And so I think sometimes what maybe more secular feminisms have traditionally focused on is sort of like which is important, right? Like economic equality. Absolutely, I believe
right,
in, we need economic justice. Um, but that doesn't really get at like how do we actually treat each other as sacred,
right, right,
right? So even if we, really disagree with each other or we're on opposite sides of a political campaign, and this is really hard to do. I can't say I'm 100%, I'm totally there, but how do we still like respect the sacredness of other beings?
right.
And I think that's maybe one of the things that distinguishes what we might call spiritual activism or sacred activism.
Mhm.
I think the other thing that's, part of it is recognizing that we really need to look at developing ourselves, not just fighting the world.
Right. Agreed. Agreed. It has to start
Yeah,
from the inside.
yeah.
Um, so the other thing I like to complain about is not complain about, but have a discussion about, and it is something that I find frustrating. For me, as a I consider myself a goddess monotheist, right? Like I have this God, um, whatever, and I believe that it doesn't matter what you call it, we're all talking about the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, it only matters to me as somebody who needs things like visual iconography to make an emotional connection to, right?
Sure.
Um, so when I spend a lot of time in women's spirituality groups on, online and occasionally in person. Um, and there's so much focus on self-empowerment
Mhm.
that I feel like they're missing the higher power piece.
Mm.
And I know that that's not for everyone,
Mhm.
but I talk to women about that because in my own life, my spiritual life, um, there I get so much, I get strength, comfort, reassurance, relief, release. And sometimes I feel like women are missing out because when there's so much emphasis on self-empowerment, it's still they have to do it all themselves. Does that make sense?
Right. Right. So you're saying it's almost more of like sort of the symbols are just sort of used as tools for empowering the self rather than the sort of deeper actual connecting with something beyond the self.
Right. Like I consider part of my spirituality to be reverence. And
Mm,
that's why I call myself a goddess worshiper. I worship her. I
mhm.
sit at an altar. I used to kneel, but my knees can't really do that anymore. But you know what I mean? To
Yeah.
to have the awe of
Mhm.
this power that creates worlds. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because no matter how empowered I am, can't create a world. You know?
Right, right, right. And so there also brings in a certain degree of humility there, right?
Which is a word women do not like. But
Mm-hmm.
when I say humility, I just mean knowing that I'm no greater than or less than anyone,
Right, right.
right? Which I think is honoring the sacred in everyone.
Mhm.
I remember years ago listening to Marianne Williamson and her saying, yes, you have this special relationship with God, but so does everyone else.
Right.
And yes, God loves you, but remember, God loves Hitler. God loves everyone. It is a source of unconditional
Mm-hmm.
love. And
Mm-hmm.
unconditional love is the great equalizer, right? Now, as human
Mm-hmm.
beings, of course, we can't. I think unconditional love is an ideal, but I don't think
Mm-hmm.
as human beings we can actually achieve unconditional love. Perhaps women
I
can with
agree.
their children. I don't have children, so I don't know what that's like. But beyond that, I don't think that we're capable because we can't help but see the world through the eyes of self,
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe
right?
maybe with pets we can, but then
Right, right.
most
And they
times,
love us.
yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. I don't know if that's something I really noticed in my own participation, but I think it's an important point. I mean, I think it's like I hear what you're saying around there can be so much focus and sort of trying to reclaim a sense of dignity and
Right,
empowerment from patriarchal structures that it can sort of go into again, maybe like either an ego inflation or
right,
even if it's not inflated, it's still sort of like reinforcing this sort of separate ego. Um,
right,
yeah.
right. Well, and the other thing, what I ran into with Church of the Goddess is, um, in trying to put forth a spirituality that is somewhat structured, the pushback that I got was, um, but you're still following this patriarchal model of religion. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Because if you look at history and you look at original matriarchal culture, I've been having this conversation a lot lately. Matriarchy is not the opposite of patriarchy.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Matriarchy is an egalitarian
Mhm.
society. And I think we need to start saying that because I think 9 out of 10 people, if you say the word matriarchy, what they envision is the Barbie movie, is the opposite of the
Mm.
patriarchy, right? But that isn't true at all. I mean, in its finer details, if you look at matrilineal, right, which is part of most matriarchal cultures, yes, it means women have more money and more power, but it doesn't mean that men have no power,
Right,
right?
right.
And I think people don't understand that. I realize I've kind of veered off in another direction, but um, I had a question forming there. So back to this whole idea of a higher power and reverence and awe of a benevolent creator, is that something the women's spirituality movement needs?
I that's an interesting question. I think the way that I approach women's spirituality as a sort of as an educator and as a teacher is it's not so much from a movement perspective. Like I'm not part of a women's spiritual goddess circle in my own life, right? So I'm always thinking about women's spirituality in terms of a multitude of ways that women experience spirituality outside of patriarchal systems, right? And so, and in my program, that's really, really different for each student, right? Now, if I think about myself personally, I mean, I'm actually very intrigued by what you're saying because I don't think that awe or reverence is usually like my MO personally. And I'm like, huh, I wonder if it should be, because I tend to, I really wrestle probably daily with this concept of a benevolent creator, right? Even though I believe it, I wrestle with it because it's like, I look around and well, how would about benevolent goddess, God, creator, allow or create so much suffering?
Because we have free will.
Right.
That's the answer to that, right? Our problems are man-made.
Yes. As a collective, yes, but at the individual level, it's kind of very hard to.
I get that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, and so I think that's why I don't tend to, maybe this is something spiritually that I'm maybe at some point in my life I will get through and maybe I need to practice that is moving into reverence. I think for me, I try to practice more like surrender, or allowing or trusting, and receiving the love.
Yes.
Right?
And that's how I think of, that integration for myself, which is to have a relationship, a good relationship with self is to have a relationship with the goddess. And to have a relationship with the goddess is to have a relationship with myself. That's a feedback loop. You know what I mean? It's the same.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing. Like, I know that, like most human beings, I go through bouts of struggling with my self-worth and my self-esteem. So it helps me to think that that is not the goddess's will for me. Her will for me is to love myself. You know what I mean? And I guess that's why I hammer on that higher power so often, is because, again, it brings me so much comfort. And no matter how evolved I become, I'm still a human being.
Yes. Yes.
And when we talk about things like suffering in the world, I have to believe that there is a much bigger picture that is so far beyond my human comprehension.
Right.
You know what I mean? And part of that helps me, and part of what helps me in that belief is that we are eternal, right? Like, this isn't my first time here. It's likely not going to be my last time here. It's that as a species, we have been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years.
Right.
And, I think about this archaeological evidence of goddess worship from, 30,000 years ago, before they even had the word goddess, right?
Sure.
This reference that has to do with the earth, but also has to do with like the stars and the moon. And you know what I mean? This kind of all encompassing. And from that grew these egalitarian societies where everybody did everything together. I'm often like, part of my soul is nostalgic for hunter-gatherer, when we were all hunter-gatherers, right? Like, if I could wake up tomorrow in that world, I probably would. Not that it didn't have its own challenges. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Every society has its challenges. But for all we know, the way the world is now, there's been some other version of this in our history that we don't know anything about.
Sure.
Does that make sense? I know that's and that time isn't linear, right?
Well, I mean, there's so much once you get really down the rabbit hole of mysticism and multiple timelines and multiple universes. It's very mysterious, and I do tend to, I mean, I agree with you in terms of that there's a bigger picture and understanding that, we can't see, but on a human level, those are the things that I'm sort of just like, really, goddess, God? Like,
Right, right. I get that. I get that. And even on a personal level, I find
yeah,
myself saying, the fuck?
yeah,
What is this? I don't deserve this, whatever this is. Right.
right, right,
So
right.
I get it. It's,
Yeah,
again, that when there was no division between this is my spiritual life and this is my material life, I can't imagine what that would have been like to just
yeah,
be. You know what
yeah.
I
You
mean?
know, but it's really interesting that you say you'd like to wake up in that world because that's not sort of like when I imagine what I would like to wake up into, it's very it's a society that is technologically advanced and has all our creature comforts. I like my comfy bed and my central heating and all of that.
Yeah, I do.
Um,
I like those things too.
but we would have learned to harness that technology in a way that's working more in harmony with nature rather than exploiting it.
Right,
And of course, a world where all of these crazy divisions we have. I mean, and just the absolute insane amount of wealth inequality in our world, right? Where it would just like in these wars and the military and like it would have to really require an evolution of consciousness in a really profound
right,
way where we, more and more people, and I don't know if everyone can get there, but will just recognize that, we are all sacred,
right,
right? And it doesn't make sense to like I mean, I think about that sometimes, like humanity, like there's sort of an inherent suffering of being human just because you have to battle with cold and the elements and illness and things like that. And but most of the suffering, is because we hurt each other
right,
and we hurt animals and we hurt nature, right?
right,
If we
right,
just had to deal with like the elemental level of suffering and pain and we're helping each other through it, that would be so like manageable.
right, right, right. Well, I mean, I guess the good news is, and I don't know what you're hearing, but a lot of the people that I talk to or people that I follow on social media, podcasts that I listen to, that we are on the precipice of great change.
I
That
hear
more
that
and
too.
more people are waking up, and I learned about something. I can't remember what it's called. There are these 8 evolutionary states of consciousness, spiral dynamics. That's what it's
Mhm.
called. Have you ever heard of
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, I think it was like Ken Wilber and a colleague of his or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Where we have these 8 levels of consciousness that both as a collective and individually, we kind of cycle up and down through these levels of consciousness. And they're color coded, not numbered, so that no one feels superior to anyone else. And
Hmm.
we're in, I think, the orange one right now, which is very much the state of the world, right? Chaos, confusion, war, anarchy. But then the next phase, the green phase, is this moving into the collective consciousness and moving away from what we've been in for the past 1,000 years at least, which is this separation consciousness.
Right. Right.
Everybody else is other.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that too. And it's kind of hard. I mean, I very much hope that that's the case. That we're seeing, you know, and I don't know if it's, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of theorists will say, no, it's actually not a more violent time. It's a more peaceful time. It's just that we're so much more aware of violence happening in other parts of the
Right.
world.
I've heard that too. I heard, of all people, I heard Marilyn Manson, who I think is very down to earth and very intelligent, say that on an interview years ago. He said, "We're not a more violent culture. We're just a more televised culture.
Yeah.
We're not feeding people to the lions anymore."
Right, right,
Right.
right, which was a certain point in history. But yeah,
But
but there are like scholars of this stuff who do statistics. I mean, I don't know, it's debated, right? But either way, I think that whether it's more or less, it's still a very violent culture.
It is very
Right.
violent. I don't know. I think, as you say, we are, I think we're more violent on the person on person violence as opposed to, warring over territory or
Mm,
religion or, you know what I
mm,
mean? Because we also know now that there are many different forms of violence,
right.
and not just physical violence. There's emotional
Right.
violence and spiritual violence. And um, I I want to say, and I'm not clear on the timeline, but I was watching. So I don't know if you're familiar with Laura Hirsch and her documentary series called From the Goddess.
I'm
It's a,
not.
it's a six-part documentary series on Vimeo. I'm actually going to have her on the show this season.
Okay.
So she did this six-part documentary series. It's available on demand on Vimeo. It's called From the Goddess. And in the first episode, when she was talking with Max Dashu, who I was also on the show this
Mhm.
season, she was saying, if you go far enough back in history in archaeological terms, beyond a certain point, when they find skeletons and gravestones and funerary rites and all of those things, beyond a certain point, they don't find any weapons.
Mm, mm,
So there
mhm,
was a time in human
mhm,
history
mhm.
when we weren't hurting each other,
Sure, sure.
which is so mind blowing for me to
Yeah.
think about. When she said that, I was like, man, like I guess I knew that, but it didn't really hit home until she put it
Yeah.
in those words. Um, some people say, we made a wrong turn when we started agriculture
Right.
because agriculture introduced concepts of ownership,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
then things went downhill from there. Um, and then it became about greed and about money, and you know those things were all once not a thing.
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know what I mean? So that's why I say I long for the hunter gatherer days, because
Sure.
what I really mean is I long for a time before things like greed and money and war were even concepts in the human imagination.
Right. I know. It's like it's so hard to imagine, right? Given what we deal
Right.
with in our current
Right.
reality, you know. I mean, in a Hindu cosmology, the
Thousands of goddesses.
well that, but also, there are these things called yugas or ages.
Mhm.
Right? And so it is, and people, there's different theories about how long we're in a Kali Yuga, which is we are like in the dark ages,
Right.
right? And that this was prophesied, and that there have been previous ages which were in harmony and living according to, truth and principles of like divine principles,
Right.
right? Um, yeah, and I mean, I think it's actually we're still supposed to be in a Kali Yuga for a really, really long time, but then others have said, well, we're gonna get like there's cycles within the cycle, so we might be getting into a cycle of like,
Right.
and it's actually very like a cycle of more peace, but it's hard for our like time limited ego and personalities to really grasp all of this.
Right. Right.
I mean, I would love to see more positive changes happening in my lifetime, I mean, I think some of the change, I mean, we have seen, even though there's still a lot of violence against women and we don't have full equality, I mean, I still think that we made massive strides,
Yes.
beginning of the women's movement. I think about how much more openness there is around LGBTQ stuff,
Right.
so it's like we have to kind of remember that when we look around and say, well, gosh, this is still happening and this is still happening. And we're, like we have to look at the strides that we've made as well.
Right. Yeah, I think that's important. Like I was listening to somebody the other day give the statistics of Fortune 500 companies that are run by women, which was still less than 50%, but
Mm-hmm.
was like 37% number of female CEOs and companies across America. It was like 47%. So yes, there is if you look for the progress, you can find it.
Right. Right. But
Something.
I also think we need to like this whole, I mean, that is progress to an extent, but it's also like a lot of times women get into positions of power just also still at the heads of these hierarchies that are exploiting the earth and exploiting people lower on
Right,
the
right,
hierarchy, right?
right.
So,
I was very angry because the person that gave those statistics, although helpful, was saying it was an answer to the question, do we still live in a patriarchy? And
yeah,
so I was like, you know what, those numbers can be true, but yes, we still live in a
yeah,
patriarchy. Are
right,
you out of your mind? Like, do you really think that those female CEOs had the same path and the same difficulties as the men's path to those CEO
right,
positions? Probably
right,
not. Probably
right,
not.
yeah. Right. And I think, you know, we need to start thinking about patriarchy not just as men over women, but as a whole system of like domination, right? Which like is what
Right.
Rihanna Isler talked about, you know, feminist theologian Elizabeth Schusser-Fiorenza calls it chiriarchy, which is like elite males over everyone else, right?
Right.
Because men are also like, you know, oppressing men through these other men through these hierarchies
Right.
of
Right.
domination. Yeah. And, you know, for me, I mean, it was in my bio, my work on veganism. And one of the worst dominations we have is the domination of animals.
Yes.
I mean, even just, you know, you talk about hunter-gatherers, but that was a very different relationship with the animals when, um, and it was actually the people say now we should call them gatherer hunters because their primary food was plant food and then an
Right.
occasional hunt that was done with, you know, animals who still had to live out in their natural lives, right?
Right.
And
And
they were,
right. And like in my own, like if you go back in history and my ancestral line, the early like upper Paleolithic, Neolithic nomadic tribes lived in symbiotic relationships with the animals. They would travel with
right.
the herds. My patron goddess is an antlered goddess, so I've read a lot about that. And they moved with the reindeer
Mm-hmm.
to different grazing areas, and they used the reindeer for food. They used their bones to make tools. You know what I mean? That kind of Native
Yeah.
American concept of every part of the deer is sacred. Um, but they also used them for warmth, right? They slept with them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they trusted that the reindeer knew where the food was as
Interesting.
they traveled.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And now we've created a system where we're, you know, we clear the like land and artificially, you know, inseminate these animals and breed them just to be, you know, basically tortured and killed for food. You know, and to me that's one of the biggest um, you know, core issues, which is not often talked about by other feminists or spiritual feminists
right,
too, outside of a very small circle of, you know, domination of other sacred beings, you know, is through our animal agriculture complex.
right, right.
Yeah, I just was very curious at how you came up with the name The Girlfriend God for your podcast.
Oh, excuse me. That information is out there. I put it up on Instagram every once in a while.
Mm.
So initially, basically what it means, and then I'll tell you what it means to me personally.
Mhm.
Girlfriend is a very versatile word, right? It can mean partner, lover, companion, but it can also mean confidant, sister, best girlfriend, right? And I use the word God instead of goddess because at the time I was using those two words interchangeably, which I still do.
Mhm.
I prefer the term goddess, and I ran an ad campaign that said, uh, if your personal Jesus isn't working out for you, maybe you need a girlfriend God.
Okay, got it. Okay, makes sense.
um, And on a personal note, the relationship that I have developed with this goddess, and in particular with my patron deity, because I believe, so I have my own, I came up kind of with my own theology, which is that the sort of new Holy Trinity that I have in my life is myself, the goddess, right? Like the OG goddess, the creator. And then there's my patron deity. And my patron deity is my bridge between myself and the goddess, because there are things about the goddess that are beyond my human understanding,
Sure.
that just simply cannot be known to me. But in my Western mind that likes labels and iconography and all of those things that allow me to emotionally connect, that's the relationship that I have with my patron deity. And she has been all of those senses of girlfriend that I would use. I would say, and I've said on the show before, this goddess is the greatest mother, lover, sister, friend, and teacher I have ever known. She has been all of those things to me. Sometimes I'm lonely and I want to be held, and then she serves as that kind of romantic partner, girlfriend. Sometimes I just really need a confidant and somebody to talk to, and she fulfills that role. You know what I mean?
I
She
love
really
that.
does meet
Yeah.
all of my emotional needs, because we're so used to trying to get our needs met by other people.
Right. Right. And
And
always sense of
right,
validation.
and how well does that usually work? Right?
Right.
Not very. I mean, of course, in a healthy way, my spouse meets a lot of my needs, and my friends meet some of my other needs, and because we're human and we have a lot of needs.
Sure.
Um, but expecting somebody else to fill me up on the inside or to make me feel complete that's a losing
Proposition.
battle, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So again, back to that, in a benevolent creator, what is my will, my often self-centered will, right? Sometimes my will is good, sometimes not. You know what I mean? Sometimes I'm just willful. Like when I need you to behave a certain way. You know what I mean? That kind of
Yeah.
willfulness. But the goddess's will for me is to be at peace, both with myself and with everyone else. So, so that's the long answer of the story of the girlfriend god, and it's very popular. People like it.
Great. I mean, and I really appreciated your explanation. It was awesome.
Yeah, she serves all functions for me, and I think she can for others. When I teach people about that Holy Trinity, especially if they don't have a particular patron goddess in mind, I
Right.
ask them that. What are you looking for?
Right.
What do you need? What are
Yeah.
you not getting met by way of your other humans?
Yeah.
And look for a goddess that represents that,
Right.
for those qualities, and then
Right.
develop that relationship. And like any relationship, she will take on different roles at different times, because you're going to have different needs on different days,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think that also kind of speaks to the sort of gender issue in a sense, and how like particularly like heterosexual men,
Mm-hmm.
if they can have that sort of relationship with a goddess who where they can feel that sort of like that warmth that they're looking for from a
Right.
romantic partner can be very
Right.
healing, right? Whereas like conversely for me as a heterosexual woman, it's like I tend to think of goddess more as like divine mother. I like the girlfriend concept too,
Yeah.
but sometimes I really like it's helpful for me to also have imagery that's male, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's
Mm-hmm.
like I crave also that masculine energy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes polytheists will say to me, well, where is your, well, you have to have balance. You have to have male and female energy. Where's your male energy coming from? And I say from her, because she
Mhm.
has it all.
Yeah,
I don't need a different godhead to get
yeah,
that masculine energy, just as we all have masculine and feminine
yeah,
energy.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it all is, it's all going to depend on how we each like interpret those terms, right?
Right,
And like
right.
understand those imageries and those words, and yeah.
And I think people underestimate what their relationship with a god or goddess can be.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I had no idea that it could be and is as emotionally rewarding
Mm-hmm.
as it is, because I thought about her in abstract terms for so long.
Right. Right. Mm.
And unfortunately, pain is the touchstone of all spiritual growth. So I didn't get to the place that I'm at without a real crisis of spirit and an existential pain
Sure. I mean,
that forced
yeah,
me to seek this out, right?
likewise.
It takes what it takes, right? I asked someone, a mentor a long time ago, I said, am I ever going to reach a point in my spiritual life where I don't have to experience a great deal of pain before I become willing to change? She said, probably not. Maybe, maybe. My tolerance for bad feelings about myself gets shorter and shorter,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
I don't pack up and move in to
Mhm.
self-pity or self-loathing or anyway. So at the end of the show, I ask all guests who haven't been on the show before 3 questions. Have you listened to the show? Do you already know what they
I
are?
have, but I don't remember what all the questions are
Oh,
because
great,
it was
great.
like before the holiday. Yeah.
Right, right. Okay. So question one is tell me something about yourself that people would be surprised to learn.
I think a lot of people who know me in my current role and profession would be surprised to learn that I was actually got my bachelor's degree in math and I was on a very different trajectory at one point in my life.
Okay. Yes. I
Yeah.
don't know you very well, but I find that shocking. So math, huh? I don't understand math people because I'm not one.
Hmm.
I'm a word person, and word people are generally not math people.
That's not always the case. I think I'm both. I've always been both. Yeah. It's
Well,
maybe
good for
rare. Maybe
you.
there's rare, but yeah.
I'm not a math person. I still have to pull out my calculator to figure out a 25% tip. Yeah, it's
Sure.
bad. It's bad. But it's okay. I accept that this is just not my it's not my wheelhouse, right?
Sure.
Okay. Current favorite television series.
I'm looking for a new television series right now,
Huh?
actually, to really sink my teeth into because I've been into K-dramas lately,
Okay.
and I just finished one called Dr. Cha, which is about just a woman in midlife sort of rediscovering herself, after having sort of left behind her career for family. It was good. It was really good. I wouldn't say it was like necessarily my favorite of all time, but it was good. And I think I'm sort of looking for the next thing that's going to really grab me.
Okay. I'm happy to give you some recommendations because my wife and I watch a shameful amount of television.
Okay.
Right now, we're watching My Brilliant Friend on HBO, which is an
It's
Italian
so
series.
it's so interesting you mentioned that because I'm reading the novel finally.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean it's funny these little synchronicities. Just the fact that you mentioned that show and I just started reading picked up the novel. It's been on my bookshelf for years. I just picked it up a few days ago.
Okay.
Have you read the
So
novel?
I haven't read the novel, so I think the series is outstanding. So I don't know how it measures up once you've read the book, because
Okay.
traditionally the book is always better.
Yeah, and sometimes that's not I mean sometimes they're just very
Yeah,
different.
I've had my instances where that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of it. It's like this. It's like the dry season, right? Where like there are no more premieres until like later in the spring. So we've been watching a lot of foreign television. Um, we just finished a series called Katla on Netflix, which
Hmm.
is very supernatural. I don't know if that's your thing or not, but so
How do
that's
you say
this
that again? How do you spell it?
Katla, Katla.
Okay.
It was, you really have to suspend disbelief, right? But it was good. And prior to that, we watched Dark on Netflix, which started out really good, but by the end, it was so convoluted and so hard to follow,
Oh,
which is
okay.
about time travel and destiny.
Yeah, I can't, at the end of the day, which is when after a busy work day, I can't deal with anything too
Too heavy.
On my
Too
brain.
heavy. Right. Well, you could also watch 30 Coins on HBO, which is supernatural and
Okay.
very much escapism.
Yeah, my friend was just telling me that I have to watch Why Women Kill.
Yes. Forget everything else I recommended and watch that.
Okay. Okay.
We did. We loved that series.
Okay. Good to know.
Loved it. Okay. And then finally, if your life were a movie, what would be the theme song on the soundtrack of your life?
Don't Stop Believing. Believing.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm amazed that 4 seasons in, there've only been like 2 or 3 instances where people have the same song.
Yeah.
So I'll be working on, I have a public playlist on Spotify with everyone's answer to this question.
Love it.
It is, as you can imagine, a very eclectic mix.
Yeah. Love it. In closing, I'd also like to thank you so much, Kelly, and also just offer anyone who's listening. I do work as a life and leadership coach, and anyone who's a listener of this podcast is welcome to book a complimentary 30-minute session with me.
Oh, nice.
And they can find more information on my website.
I might take you up on that myself. And talk to you about CIIS, which I've toyed with the idea of applying to.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk with you. Absolutely.
Okay. I would definitely need a scholarship though, because I'm 52 and unemployed and on disability. So, but I know that there's help available out there. I just have to find it.
Exactly.
I'm a good student. I miss being in school. I would have been one of those career students if I'd had the opportunity.
Yeah. I could see that.
Well, I will be in touch when I have final files available. But until then, Alka, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had fun. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Kelly. This was so much fun.
It was fun, right?
I really appreciated learning a little bit about your journey and your relationship with Goddess, and it's inspiring.
Oh, well, thank you. It was inspiring to learn about you.
Yeah. Thanks again.
I will be in touch. But until then, at the end of every show, I say I wish you the peace and the love of the Goddess.
Oh, thank you. Likewise. Bye.
All right. Thanks for watching or listening to The Girlfriend God. Don't forget to like, rate, review, subscribe, follow, and comment. Episodes drop every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and you can follow The Girlfriend God on social media on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.